Lori Gottlieb, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I'm so glad to have you here at last. And it could have been a year ago. I have to apologize. I could have been probably one of the first people to interview you. I'm not sure when it all started, but uh, I'm doing a podcast every week. I get about a book a week, and so I have to quickly scan the book, take a look at it, see if I think it's going to be a good fit. So, looking at your book, I thought, boy, this person, it looks like it's case histories. Looks like this person is already very successful. She doesn't really need a boost from me. So, I decided to take a pass on it. Then later, my wife started reading me over the breakfast table, reading from your book because she was loving it. And I'm going, oh my God, I should have interviewed her. So then I got in touch with your publicist really quickly and say, hey, is there a chance I could? And yes, you can.
Well,
So
thank you to your wife for reading the book and sharing it with you.
yeah, really, it really got me into it. And then also I listened to a podcast interview with you by Rich Roll, who's one of my
Hmm.
favorite podcasters.
Yeah, I love him.
Yeah, 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 really. Um, so, let's talk about your book and sort of how you got there. You have a very interesting both academic background and vocational background. Maybe you could take us through some of the major stepping stones in your career that led up to you being, an incredible writer, an incredible therapist.
Right. So, yeah, I have a very nonlinear path to becoming a therapist, to say the
Welcome to the
least.
club.
Right, right. But I think that that's useful. So I think that there's something about having lived life a bit when you're going into a therapy room and dealing with all kinds of people that I think is really an asset. Um, and so I think that there's one thing. There's part of it is sort of having the skill, and another part of it is having the lived experience. For me, when I never thought I would become a therapist, that hadn't been something I had been thinking about. I went straight from college to working in film development and then ultimately network television development because I was really interested, obviously, in the human condition, but in story and telling
Uh-huh.
stories about the human condition.
Sure.
And um, when I got to NBC, I was in my mid to late 20s at that point, and two shows were premiering. One was called Friends, and the other was called ER. And on ER, we had a consultant in the emergency room who was there to make sure that the show was accurate in terms of how we portrayed, the trauma-based scenes and every detail of that show. And I spent a lot of time in the ER supposedly doing research, but actually I just was so moved by the rich human stories that were playing out before my eyes. Real people's lives. And I think that while on the show, the stories were incredibly real and moving. I think that when people come to an emergency room, there's an inflection point, right? It's like you don't go to an emergency room because you expected something to happen. And so I was really fascinated by that. And at one point, the consultant said, it seems like you like it better here than you like your day job. Maybe you should go to medical school. And I should say that I was a French major in college, um, which doesn't mean I wasn't in math and I wasn't like a math science person because I was, but I very much was a humanities focused person in terms of sort of where I went academically. And so I ended up going to Stanford for medical school. And when I got there, um, I realized that it was this new kind of healthcare system where everybody was talking about managed care and how my idea of being the family physician who guides people through their lives was going to be harder in this new world. And
Sadly,
so,
yes. Sadly.
right.
All right.
And so I left medical school to become a journalist. I started writing when I was in medical school, and I left to become a journalist. And I'm still a journalist, but I still I write the Dear Therapist column for the Atlantic, and I write features and book reviews and all kinds of things. But I was really interested in telling people stories, and that's where I felt like I could do kind of story in the human condition. And later, 10 years later, after I had a baby, and I realized I needed adults to talk to during the day, which you don't get to do a lot as a journalist. Um, I would sort of detain the UPS guy who was, bringing all the baby deliveries, and he sort of would back away to his big brown truck, and I realized I need to professionally do something where I'm interacting in a way that I want to interact, with other humans. And I called up the dean at the medical school and I said, maybe I should come back and do psychiatry. And she told me that I was welcome to come back, but she felt like because of what I wanted to do, that psychiatry was more about medication management and not the kind of work I wanted
Right.
to do. And so she suggested that I get a graduate degree in clinical psychology, which is what I did. And I feel like I went from telling people stories as a journalist to helping people to change their stories as a therapist.
Yeah.
And I feel like everything that I did, even though it sounds very nonlinear, I feel like I'm simply looking at story in the human condition through different lenses.
Yeah. When you look back over your life, uh, sometimes you see that it almost looks predestined. You can see the thread running through it and what the underlying purpose was.
Yeah, I think at the time, a lot of people, didn't understand the choices that I was making because it was something that came internally from a
Yeah,
place
you're
of
being
knowing.
guided intuitively. I've got my own stories about that. Yeah.
Right, right. And so I think, my joke at the time was I'm either very versatile or very confused. And that was simply what I would say to get people to stop telling me what I
Yeah.
should or shouldn't be doing, career wise. But and even though I didn't, in retrospect, of course, it makes sense. At the time, I didn't have a cohesive narrative for why I was doing what I was doing, but I knew that it was the right step and
Hmm.
that it would get me to where I wanted to go ultimately. And I think that
Yeah.
that's really important for people to think about is, who's living your life. It's not the people who are telling you what to do. It's your life, and I think it's important for us to listen to ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. This is I really appreciate you sharing all of this. It's such a great lead up to your book. I wanted to ask you too how you became such a great therapist. And I did see that you went to the Wright Institute, which I'm very familiar with the Wright Institute up in the Bay Area here. Um, and I guess you probably had a lot of freedom to choose your own program. Is that it?
I was only at the Wright Institute for a year as a trainee, and then I did most of my training at the Maple Center here in Los Angeles. Um, and and that was where I did like the bulk of my clinical training.
Okay.
And I think that how do we become, I don't, I think I'm learning still. I think we're all learning. I'm not, I came to this late in life, so I'm not somebody who's been doing this for decades and decades. I've been doing this for about 10 years. And so I feel like I'm learning every day. And I feel like that, the interesting part of maybe you should talk to someone in my book is that you see me as both clinician and patient, right? So you see me going into therapy with my own therapist, and I'm learning so much from him because he has so much more experience than I do. And I think we learn from one another as therapists. And I
Yeah.
think that you also come into your own at a certain point where you bring your own personality into the room, you bring your own style into the room. You feel differently as you're sitting in that chair the more you do it.
Yeah. How would you describe your school of therapy or style of therapy?
Yeah, people ask that a lot. And I feel like, I could name so many different things. I come mostly from an attachment perspective, but I would say I come from a human perspective, which is I use all the training that we've all had. But at the same time, I think that it's very much about the relationship between me and the client and what's happening in the room as a microcosm for what might be happening for them outside of the room. So I do a lot of what's going on between us in the room. Um, and that I find very effective because it's very experiential. It's different from talking about something theoretically and experiencing it in the moment, which can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah. Now, the title of your book is Maybe You Should See Someone. And there's an interesting story that you tell about how you came up with that title.
Yeah,
I
so it's
hope you
maybe you should
remember
talk
it.
to someone. The title is actually maybe you should talk to someone,
Okay, did I get
and
that
the
wrong?
same
Yeah.
meaning. And yeah, that came, the title came up because actually my friend Alice came up with it, because and she had was very familiar with the manuscript, and was sort of helping me structure it and doing all kinds of things. And she she, we were deciding sort of what to call the book. And there's this line in the book where a friend who is a therapist says to me, maybe you should talk to someone because I was going through something too. I think I should back up and say the book follows four very seemingly different patients as they go through their struggles. And then I'm the fifth patient as I go through something in my own life simultaneously and I go to therapy. So there are five patients in the book, one of whom is me.
Yeah.
And it's at that early point in the book when my friend who's a therapist, and of course it's hard to find a therapist as a therapist because you can't go to anybody that you have any sort of even tangential relationship with. And so, because it's such a close knit community, it's hard to find someone that you don't have any connection to just go in and do therapy with. So she was the person who said, maybe you should talk to someone. And the title of the book doesn't necessarily mean maybe the reader, whoever that is, right? Maybe everybody should go to therapy. It doesn't mean that. It means maybe we should all talk more to one another. So I do think that therapy is very helpful for a lot of people, but I think mostly what this book is about, it's about how we all grow in connection with one another.
Yeah.
And I think it's about, I say at the very beginning of the book that my most significant credential is that I'm a card-carrying member of the human race. And I really feel like what the book is showing is that we're all more the same than we are different. And so we need to talk more about that because so often we feel isolated in our experiences because we're not talking about it. We aren't, talking to someone.
Well, it was courageous of you to make yourself patient number 5, running throughout the book. The thread of your story runs sort of parallel all the way throughout the book. Did you struggle with being that self-revealing?
Well, what's funny about that is that, as you can see in the book, I talk about the fact that I was originally, publishers wanted me to write this over-parenting book, this helicopter parenting book, because I'd written this cover story for The Atlantic about it, about, what was going on with parents and kids nowadays. And I didn't want to write that book. I didn't feel like that would be doing people a service. I felt like my article said what I wanted to say. And I didn't want to just eke out a book for the, sort of jumping on that commercial bandwagon, but not really feeling any connection to the book. And I think that's what happens as a therapist is that you start to really get to the core of what matters and what is important and what is one's purpose, right? And so I said to the publisher, I'm really interested in what's going on with the adults because that's what I was doing as a therapist. And they said, oh, you want to write a happiness book? I said, no, I really don't want to write a happiness book. Well, I think happiness as a byproduct of living our lives in a fulfilling way is certainly, I think, what most of us want. But happiness as a goal in and of itself, as we all know, is a recipe for disappointment and disaster. And so I didn't want to write that, but I thought I'll shape the book the way I want to. But it turned out that I just couldn't get myself to write the book. And in fact, I was getting depressed in the process of writing the book because I couldn't really write the book. And I felt like
the happiness book, you're getting depressed writing it.
Well, right. The irony, right? I called it the miserable depression inducing happiness book because that's what it did. And I ended up canceling that book to write this book, to write Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, where I really just wanted people to see human beings as they really are. I wanted to show the human condition because I think it's really inspiring. I think that what people say to us, well, isn't it depressing seeing people all day and hearing their stories? And I say, no, it's actually really inspiring.
Yeah.
There are all these heroic moments. You see people change bit by bit, and in ways that really transform the way that they live. And it's one aha moment, it's like these little increments. And I think it's, and to see people reveal themselves and to show the truth of who they are and to have those deep, rich human interactions with other people, I think it's a privilege to do what we do and an honor. And so I really wanted to bring people who are not therapists into that world because I feel like we can see ourselves most clearly through the lens of other people's stories. So I think people learn a lot about themselves by reading about these people. I think readers have said they can see themselves in every single one of these patients, including me, by the end, even though at the beginning they didn't maybe think that. So with this book, when you ask about revealing myself, everybody said, no one's going to read this book. And so when I wrote the first draft of it, I thought, well, for the 3 people who read it, at least it's the book that I want to write, and that I feel like matters and will resonate with these 3 people. And then I turned it into my publisher, and they had this reaction where everybody started saying, oh my gosh, I laughed, I cried, I'm passing it around, I see myself, my partner, my sibling, my parents, my, everything in this book. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe 300 or 3,000 people will read it. And I had this moment of, maybe I should clean myself up a little bit, because more than 3 people are going to read it now. And it was on the New York Times bestseller list for more than a year, and it's something that a lot of people are reading. And so if I had known that so many people would read it, I might have been more self-conscious about how much I disclosed, or the way that I disclosed it.
Yeah.
But I think that, ironically, the reason that so many people are reading it is because I didn't clean myself up. It's because
Yes.
it's
Yes.
so authentic.
Yeah, it's perfect. It's perfect. And how about the 4 patients that you chose? Um, there might have been confidentiality issues there. How did you go about choosing them?
Yeah. So, I, first of all, there were some rules that I had for myself. And one was that I wasn't going to write about anybody that I was currently seeing on a regular basis, because I couldn't do the work with them and then be writing about them, even if what I was writing about happened 5 years earlier. So, so I wasn't doing the work with them at the time that I was seeing them. Second, of course, I had to get permissions. Of course, I had to change all the identifying details, etc. And I also was very intentional about who I chose, in the sense of, there might have been certain people where I thought I'd really like to follow this person's story in the book, but I didn't even broach the topic with them. I just didn't include them in the book, because for clinical reasons. One example might be that the person would think like, they maybe really didn't want to do it, but because they had a tendency to want to please me, that they would say yes, even though they didn't actually
Yeah.
want that.
Yeah.
And so with that kind of person, I didn't want to ask. Another person might feel like, oh, you love me the best, I'm your star patient, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they were selected for the book, and I knew somebody like that, and I didn't want to, I wanted to make sure that clinically, it wasn't going to be a choice that would maybe have a negative impact.
Actually, I seem to recall, I guess maybe it was from the other podcast that I listened to, that you had already terminated with the 4 people. Is that right? So
Yeah, I
yeah,
wasn't currently seeing them, right? So
yeah,
that was
right.
why, yeah, I couldn't separate out. I felt like it would be much too blurry and murky to try to write about people that you're currently seeing.
Yeah. Um, so, you know, I think it's a great book. Evidently, a huge number of other people out there do. Do you have any sense of the numbers at this point? I know you were on the New York Times bestseller list for a long time, maybe still, I
Yeah,
don't know. What do you
yeah,
think the numbers are at this point?
yeah, a lot, like
A lot.
an
Okay.
astounding number. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wonder, given the success of the book and all the interviews that you've done discussing it and so on, um, how has written that writing that book, having written that book, how's that impacted you, your life, how you look at yourself, where you want to go next? Anything there?
Yeah, I mean, it's had an impact in the sense that I'm so moved by the reaction that people have had to the book. Even the patients themselves, who said to me, all in different ways afterward, they said, I knew how much you cared about me when we were
Wow.
working together, but reading this book um, made it very real in a very different way. That they were so moved by, the idea that they didn't know, for example, that I thought about them between sessions, or that if they didn't come, on time, I worried about what happened to them.
Oh, yeah.
Or, just like that they came to mind, that I had them in mind, outside of that 50 minutes once a week, right?
Yeah.
And that they impacted me, and that they held up a mirror to me and made me ask myself the very questions that they were asking themselves. That they helped me in certain ways that they could never have known had they not read the book. Meaning, I had to examine myself in exactly the ways that they were examining themselves, and that sometimes incidents that would happen in the room, were extremely meaningful to me in terms of my own growth and my own transformation.
Yeah, one thing that I want to say is that I think that this book would be extremely useful for both for therapists and therapists in training, people who are thinking of being therapists and so on, because you do show so much of the inside process, and but also will give them something to aspire to, I think. Yeah, so
Yeah, they're
I
using
think
it.
this book's destined to become a classic. There are other books. Irving Yalom is somebody who's written very powerfully about therapy case histories and in a very lively way. There, back when I was very young, there was a book called The 50-Minute Hour, which was
Mm.
extremely influential. It was maybe the first book where somebody really took on that sort of a task. Um, it makes me wonder about the thing that I'm hearing in your story is how good you have been at listening to your inner heart sense of purpose, even when you couldn't explain it to other people how it was going to fit together. You may not have even seen that picture for yourself, but you just had an inner sense of guidance. And I'm wondering, is there something the way that you were raised or the way that your parents were or something like that that instilled that inner direction and the courage to follow your own light?
I think I had a sense, even at a young age, that life has 100% mortality rate, and not just for other people. And it's not because there was early death that I was surrounded by or anything like that. Um, I don't know where that came from,
Hmm.
but I feel like, when I was working with Julie, who is the young woman with cancer, and maybe you should talk to someone, I think that what resonated so much with me, and I think what made our relationship so powerful, was that I had always sort of been thinking about that, about our limited time, and then to be faced with somebody who was so young and who really had limited time, in a very concrete way. Um, Made me really think even more about that, and making sure that my child, that my patients, that we wake up every day with intention, in terms of saying, what am I spending my time doing? And given that I don't have unlimited time, what are my priorities? What are the things I want to spend more time on? What are the things that I want to spend less time on? Who are the people I want to prioritize? Who are the people that I really, don't need to give so much emotional real estate to, right?
Yeah,
Um, so I think there was just always this sense of having sort of death on one shoulder, and I don't mean in a morbid way, but I mean in a way that creates awareness around.
sure.
We have this gift of, we're living literally on borrowed time, right? So
Yeah,
we have this gift of being here for however long. Most of us don't know how or when we will die, and so we want to kind of make choices that feel true to us, as opposed to what somebody else thinks we should do with this one life we have.
yeah. As a therapist, as a writer, are there any sort of heroes that you look to, the people that provide you with a sense of inspiration and guiding light?
Oh, so many. You mentioned Yalom earlier. Irv Yalom is,
Yes.
I think, just an incredible person. I have, he actually wrote a testimonial for my book, and having him read my book was, just such an honor,
Yeah.
because I've always admired him so much, the work that he does, the way that he works, his wisdom, his craft as a writer, all of that. So certainly anything by Irv Yalom has been incredibly influential to me. I think good novels are really influential to me, because I think that the best novels are ones that really capture psychological truths in a very real way, right? So what are the
Yeah.
novels that tend to be the ones that resonate the most with us, are the ones that reveal something about who we are as people,
Yeah.
and the parts of us that we don't generally talk about. So I would say, a good novel is as good a primer on psychological theory as anything.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because as an undergraduate, I majored in creative writing, and I felt behind in terms of the literary canon because I went to a parochial school, uh, and so I read intensely and widely as an undergraduate. Uh, and it might have been hard to justify that to anybody else, but I read all of that stuff a lot more than textbooks, because it felt to me like it was really important. And for the same thing that you've been talking about, I was drawn to become a therapist because I thought, well, this will be a way to talk about the brass tacks of life and what it is to be a human being. So
Yeah.
yeah, I have. Uh, well, as we wrap things up here, I know you've got other things that you've got to move on to. I wonder if there are any last words or anything that we didn't cover that you were hoping that would be said.
No, I mean, I love being in conversation about these things. I think
Yeah.
that, when we talk about therapy, I feel like we're really talking about the human condition. And I think that's what I tried to do in my book, was to, not write a book about therapy, but to write a book about the human condition.
Uh-huh.
And also I think to show what therapy is and also what it isn't. I think there's so many misconceptions out there about what therapy is, which I think prevents people from even going near it, either as a clinician, as a profession,
Yeah.
or also as a client. I think that some people think that therapy is, you go to therapy, you're going to talk about your childhood ad nauseum, and you're never going to leave, which is just not what we do. And I
Yeah.
think the other idea about therapy is that you're going to come, you're going to download the problem of the week, you're going to leave, you're not going to think about your therapy at all. It like exists in amber. It exists in amber, and then you come back and you download the next problem of the week, which doesn't get you anywhere. We always like to say, insight is the Booby Prize of therapy. I don't know if you've heard that expression, but I love that expression because it's kind of like you can have all the insight in the world, but if you don't make changes out in the world, the insight is useless. So people will say, they'll come in and they'll say something like, well, now I understand why I got into that argument with my husband, with my wife, with, whatever, with my sibling. And I'll say, well, did you do something different? And they'll say, well, no, but now I understand why I do that.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great step, but you actually have to change something. And I think that one of the best things to come out of therapy is that people can understand their role in what's not working. So a lot of people, when they come in, they say, I want something to change. And usually what they want to change is someone else or something else out
Right.
there. Right? I
Right.
don't think I have to change what I'm doing. And I don't mean that, there aren't difficult circumstances or difficult people out there. When I was training, one of my supervisors said, before diagnosing someone with depression, make sure they aren't surrounded by assholes. So, and I've always remembered that. That always stuck with me because, of course, right, there are difficult people and circumstances out there. But then we have to say, as adults, we have a certain amount of freedom that we did not
Yeah.
have growing up. And so I think people forget that they're out of jail, that they're free now. And so, what is our role in that situation? Do you need to be in relationship with this difficult person? And if so, what is your role in perpetuating your side of it, the tension, right? So
Yeah.
what are you doing that you could do differently? And so I think once we go from sort of victim to hero, from like the supporting character to the main character in our own lives. And I did a TED talk recently about how we can change our stories and why changing our stories is crucial if we're going to change our lives in any way, and how a lot of the time the stories we tell ourselves keep us stuck. We and I feel like that's the process of
Lori, I need to jump in here and thank you for being my guest today, because I'm noticing that our internet connection is getting flaky anyway. So
Oh,
it's
okay.
we
Yeah.
better jump off. But I
Well,
thank you
thank you
so
so much.
yeah, and thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Rap Radio.